My name is Helen Peterson, I'm 62 years old, and at my own son's wedding, my new daughter-in-law introduced me to her parents as the family disgrace. Before I tell you how that single moment led to her divorce and the collapse of her father's reputation, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The champagne flutes clinked together, a sound like tiny, expensive bells, but it was all just noise to me. I was standing in a corner of the grand pavilion, a glass of water feeling heavy in my hand, watching the blur of pastel dresses and dark suits swirl across the polished dance floor. We were in Napa Valley, at an estate so grand it felt more like a movie set than a real place. Grapevines stretched for miles under the perfect California sun, and the air smelled of money and roses. My son Mark was out there, dancing with his new wife Tiffany. He had a smile on his face I hadn't seen since before his father, David, passed away. For that, at least, I was grateful. I'd chosen my dress carefully for the occasion. A simple navy blue sheath from a department store. Modest. Understated. Invisible. It was a role I had perfected over the last 15 years. The quiet widow, living comfortably but not lavishly, on an engineer's pension and a life insurance policy. It was a simple story, a believable one. And it was a complete lie. I saw Tiffany break away from the dance floor, her white dress, which probably cost more than my car, shimmering under the fairy lights. She was dragging her parents along with her, a triumphant look on her perfectly made-up face. I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. In the few times I'd met her leading up to the wedding, she treated me like a curious, slightly embarrassing piece of furniture she'd inherited. Her questions were always pointed, digging into my finances, my quiet life in Sacramento, always with a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor by even asking. "There you are," she chirped, her voice loud enough to cut through the music. A few nearby guests turned to look. Her father, Arthur Vance, was a tall, imposing man with a politician's smile and cold eyes. Her mother, Catherine, looked me up and down, her expression one of mild distaste, as if she'd just spotted a stain on the tablecloth. "Mom, Dad," Tiffany said, looping her arm through Mark's as he joined them. "I want you to finally meet Mark's mother." She paused for dramatic effect, her smile widening into something sharp and cruel. She gestured toward me, not with her hand, but with a dismissive flick of her head. "And this," she announced to her parents and anyone else within earshot, "is the family disgrace we have to tolerate." The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Catherine Vance let out a small, condescending chuckle. Arthur's smile tightened, a look of polite amusement that didn't reach his eyes. I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck, the kind that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with pure, unadulterated rage. My hand, the one holding the water glass, trembled slightly. I wanted to throw it. I wanted to scream. But I did what I always do. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and prepared to absorb the blow with quiet dignity. Mark looked mortified, his face flushed. "Tiffany, don't," he started, but it was too late. Her father, Arthur, had been studying my face. His polite smile had vanished, replaced by a look of dawning confusion, then utter disbelief. He took a half step forward, squinting as if trying to place me. His mouth opened and closed silently once, then twice. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. "Wait a minute," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He ignored his daughter, his wife, everyone. His eyes were locked on mine. I know you. Weren't you at the Vance Industries board meeting? The acquisition." Tiffany's triumphant expression faltered. "Dad, what are you talking about? This is Mark's mom. She's retired." But Arthur wasn't listening. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You're the silent investor. The one no one ever met. You're the CEO of the firm that bought my company." A sudden chilling silence fell over our little group. The music from the dance floor seemed to fade into a distant hum. Every head turned. Tiffany's perfect smile froze, then shattered like cheap glass. Mark looked from his new father-in-law to me, his face a mask of absolute confusion. I met Arthur Vance's terrified gaze, the eyes of a man who had just realized the quiet, embarrassing old woman in the corner was the one who owned his company, his career, his entire inheritance. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the unspoken truth of 15 years. And in that silence, I finally opened my mouth to speak. To understand how a woman like me ended up holding a man like Arthur Vance's entire life in my hands, you have to understand the life I built for myself. The life I chose. After my husband David died, I had a choice. We weren't just comfortable, we were wealthy. Frighteningly so. The numbers in the portfolio George Croft managed for us felt like fiction. But I looked at my son Mark, then just 27 and starting his career in marketing, so full of that fiery ambition to prove himself, and I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let that money become a shadow that followed him, a giant asterisk next to every success he ever earned. I didn't want him to have the kind of life where he never knew if people liked him for him, or for his potential inheritance. I had seen what unearned wealth did to other families, turning children into complacent, entitled adults. My son deserved better. He deserved the dignity of his own struggle and the pride of his own victory. So, I perfected the art of being invisible. It became my life's mission. I sold our large, beautiful home in Palo Alto, a place filled with too many memories anyway, and bought a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in Sacramento. It was nice, clean, safe. The kind of place a retired widow would live. I traded my luxury sedan for a reliable Toyota Camry, a car that blended into any parking lot. I shopped for groceries at Safeway on Tuesdays for the senior discount, and bought my clothes at Macy's during the holiday sales. My life was a carefully constructed fortress of normalcy, built brick by brick with believable details. My neighbors knew me as Helen, the quiet woman who grew excellent tomatoes on her balcony and always brought a casserole to the building potluck. Mark bought it completely. Why wouldn't he? It's what he saw. He saw his mom, grieving but strong, managing her finances prudently. He believed the story that David's pension and a modest life insurance policy were enough to keep me comfortable. He was proud of me for being so sensible. He was proud of himself for making his own way, earning every single promotion, saving for his own down payment for years without ever needing a handout. And I was prouder of him than he could ever know. Every time he'd call, excited about a small raise in his salary, my heart would swell. That was real. He had earned that. This was the woman Tiffany met. I remember one specific Saturday about 3 months before the wedding. They came to visit, and Tiffany insisted on taking me shopping for a new outfit for some pre-wedding event. She dragged me to a high-end boutique where the price tags made my eyes water. Not because I couldn't afford them, but because they were absurd. I gently guided her to a more reasonable department store. As I was looking at a simple but elegant dress, she picked up the price tag and sighed dramatically. "Oh, Helen," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "Don't you worry about the cost. This can be my treat. We need to get you something that looks appropriate." The implication was clear. My taste was cheap and I needed her charity. I just smiled and politely declined, finding a dress on the clearance rack instead. She rolled her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. That was the theme of our relationship. Her constant, condescending assessments. Her thinly veiled pity. She was cataloging my financial limitations, filing me away in a box labeled harmless, slightly poor mother-in-law. I let her. I smiled my gentle, placid smile and played the part she expected me to play. "Oh, I have everything I need, dear," I'd say. It was the truth, just not the one she was looking for. I never imagined that my performance was so convincing it would lead her to believe she could publicly humiliate me without any consequences. I never imagined my greatest act of protection for my son would become the very thing my daughter-in-law would use as a weapon against me. The foundation of my invisibility was built on a secret born in a cluttered garage in Palo Alto. Back when the internet was still a dial-up scream and Silicon Valley was a dream being coded into existence. My husband, David, wasn't just an engineer. He was a true visionary. He saw the future in ways that baffled most people. While his colleagues were chasing faster processing speeds, David was obsessed with a problem no one else seemed to care about yet: power. He'd spend nights and weekends surrounded by circuit boards and schematics, fueled by black coffee and an unshakable belief that batteries were the future's biggest bottleneck. His corner of the garage was a chaotic symphony of wires and soldering irons. "Everything's going to be portable, Helen," he'd tell me, his eyes shining with an intensity that always captivated me. "Phones, music, computers, our entire lives will be in our pockets. But it's all useless if you're always chained to a wall. Freedom isn't the device. It's the power that runs it. In 2010, after years of relentless work, countless failures, and one near-disastrous electrical fire, he cracked it. He created a power management system, a tiny chip that could revolutionize battery efficiency, making them last longer, charge faster, and degrade slower. It was brilliant. We knew it was valuable. We just had no idea how valuable. We took it to a major tech firm, expecting a tough negotiation, maybe a decent offer. What followed was a whirlwind of meetings with teams of serious-looking lawyers in glass-walled conference rooms. In 2012, we sold the patent. The final number was $30 million. I remember the day the money was wired. I logged into our online banking portal and there it was. The number didn't even look real. It was just a string of digits and commas that my brain couldn't process. I called David into our home office. He stared at the screen for a full minute, completely silent. Then he let out a long, slow breath and just said, "Huh." That night we didn't celebrate. We sat on our back porch with a cheap bottle of wine and talked for hours. We talked about what this money meant. It was freedom, yes, but it was also a burden. A massive, complicated burden. It was then that we made the pact. We would tell Mark we'd received a nice payout, enough to be comfortable, enough to ensure I'd be taken care of after David was gone. He was thrilled for us. He figured it was $1 million or $2 million maybe. A life-changing amount but not a world-bending one. We never corrected him. That $30 million was just the seed money. David, with the help of a shrewd financial advisor named George Croft, had another gift. He understood the flow of money. We didn't buy a yacht or a mansion. We lived in the same house. We drove the same cars. We took that money and we began to invest. We were methodical, patient. We started with conservative stocks, then moved into growth companies. We bought real estate in emerging markets. We funded tech startups that had solid fundamentals. David had a nose for undervalued opportunities, for the quiet company in a boring field that was about to become essential. By the time he got sick, our portfolio was worth hundreds of millions. When he passed away 5 years ago, it was closing in on $1 billion. $1 billion managed from my cozy Sacramento apartment, on a laptop that Tiffany probably thought was ancient. I continued his work, not just preserving the wealth but growing it, following the principles he'd taught me. It was my way of keeping a part of him alive, of honoring his genius. But that secret, that massive silent fortune, was a sleeping giant. And Tiffany, with her careless cruelty, had just walked right up and poked it with a stick. What I didn't know was that David's legacy, the one I had guarded so fiercely, was about to become a weapon in a war I never wanted to fight. The irony of it all was almost poetic, the kind of twist you'd read in a novel. The company that Arthur Vance had just realized I owned? Vance Industries? I hadn't bought it for revenge or with any knowledge of its connection to my son's future wife. I'd bought it because it was a classic David Peterson-style investment. A fundamentally sound company being driven into the ground by a terrible leader. 3 years ago, George Croft brought it to my attention during one of our quarterly reviews. "Take a look at this one, Helen," he'd said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Vance Industries. Manufacturing firm, old school. Been around for 50 years. The numbers told a story of decline. Vance Industries was bleeding money. Arthur Vance, who had inherited the company from his father, was a man with an ego far larger than his business acumen. In a fit of what he likely saw as bold ambition, he had overleveraged the company to the hilt, buying up smaller competitors with borrowed money. When the market took a slight downturn, his house of cards started to wobble. The debt payments were crushing him. The banks were circling. He was desperate. "He's a fool," George had said bluntly, pointing to the financials. "He's got a solid core business, loyal clients, a skilled workforce. But his debt management is a disaster. He's trying to build an empire on a foundation of sand. Another 6 months, maybe a year, and he'll have to declare bankruptcy." So I did what David would have done. I saw the value hidden beneath the mismanagement. Through a series of discrete shell corporations and investment firms, all perfectly legal, but designed for absolute anonymity, I made an offer. It was a lowball offer, yes, but it was a lifeline. It was enough to pay off the banks and keep the company afloat. Arthur, believing he was selling to a large, faceless corporate investment firm to avoid the total humiliation of bankruptcy, had no choice but to accept. He probably saw it as the greatest failure of his career. I saw it as a Tuesday. George had advised me not to go to the final signing. "There's no need, Helen. Your lawyers can handle it. It's cleaner this way." But something made me want to go. A gut feeling. "No," I told him. "I want to be in the room." I sat silently in the back of the boardroom while my team of lawyers, sharp and efficient, handled the details. I was introduced as a silent partner of formality. Arthur Vance strode in, shook hands with my lead lawyer, and barely glanced at me. To him, I was just some rich man's wife, a piece of decorative background noise. He had no idea he was shaking hands with his new boss. His arrogance was palpable. Even in defeat, he carried himself like a king being exiled from his own kingdom. After the acquisition, my management team went in. We did exactly what George had outlined. We restructured the debt, trimmed the fat from Arthur's vanity projects, and reinvested in the core business. We gave raises to the underpaid engineers and updated the aging factory equipment. We didn't just save the company, we made it thrive. We protected the jobs of hundreds of employees who would have been out on the street because of Arthur's recklessness. And here was the kicker, the part that made my blood sing with a cold, clear sense of justice there at the wedding. A significant portion of the Vance family's income, the money that paid for Tiffany's designer dress and that ridiculous ice sculpture of a swan, came from Arthur's generous consulting fee. A fee that I, his new, anonymous boss, had personally approved to ensure a smooth transition and keep his institutional knowledge on hand for a year. For 3 years, the man whose daughter had just publicly called me a disgrace had been living on my payroll. While Tiffany was looking down her nose at my modest apartment, I was the one signing the checks that kept the roof over her head. The predator, so sure of his place at the top of the food chain, had been prey all along, and he was only just beginning to realize it. The morning after the wedding was a whirlwind of frantic, whispered phone calls. Mark called me at 7 a.m., his voice a jumble of confusion, hurt, and anger. "Mom, what the hell was that? Arthur Vance cornered me after you left." He was practically hyperventilating. He kept asking all these insane questions about Dad's patents, about your investments. He thinks you're some kind of secret billionaire. What is going on? I mumbled something about it being a misunderstanding, that Mr. Vance must have been drinking and gotten a wild idea. But my heart was pounding against my ribs. The walls of my carefully constructed world were starting to crack. Before I could even finish my first cup of coffee, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Tiffany. "Helen, I think we should all have lunch today. Clear the air. Just family. Clear the air." I knew exactly what that meant. It meant she'd spent the night grilling her father, and was now ready for an interrogation. It was a summons. She'd chosen the venue, a ridiculously expensive French restaurant downtown called L'Orangerie, the kind of place where the water menu has its own page and a salad costs $50. It was a power move designed to put me on the defensive, to make me feel small and out of my element. When Mark and I walked in, she was already there, seated at the best table in the house, a panoramic view of the city behind her. She was wearing a crisp, white power suit that probably cost a month's rent on my apartment. She looked less like a newlywed and more like a prosecutor about to begin a cross-examination. "Helen. Mark. So glad you could make it," she said, her smile bright and brittle. She hugged Mark, then turned to me, her green eyes scanning my simple black dress and understated pearl necklace with a flicker of amusement. The small talk was excruciating. Tiffany talked animatedly about their honeymoon plans. A month in the Maldives. Mark was quiet, pushing a piece of bread around his plate. As soon as the waiter left with our order, Tiffany folded her hands on the table and got down to business. She ignored Mark completely, her focus entirely on me. "You know, Helen," she began, her tone light and conversational, "I had the most fascinating chat with Daddy last night. He told me all about his experience selling the company. It's a real case study in corporate acquisitions, something they should teach at Wharton." I just took a sip of my wine and waited. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "The thing about anonymous investors," she continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "is that they're usually anonymous for a reason. Usually, it involves vast fortunes they'd rather not have the IRS or say new family members know about. Mark looked back and forth between us, a frown creasing his forehead. Tiffany, what is this about? You're making my mom uncomfortable. She waved a dismissive hand at him, never taking her eyes off me. Oh, honey, this is a conversation for the adults. Daddy said the woman at the signing was quiet, almost invisible. But there was something about her and authority. He said he should have paid more attention. She then pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate and theatrical. She tapped the screen a few times and then slid it across the white tablecloth toward me. On the screen was a grainy photo from a 3-year-old financial news article about the Vance Industries acquisition. There, half hidden behind a lawyer, was a woman in a navy blue dress. My dress. My face was mostly obscured, but the posture, the way I held my purse, it was undeniably me. The image quality isn't the best, Tiffany said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. But the resemblance is just uncanny, don't you think? She sat back, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She thought she had me. She thought she had just played the winning card. So Helen, she said, her eyes glittering with greed. It seems there are a lot of things we don't know about each other. Why don't you start talking? I looked at the picture on her phone, the grainy image of my past self. Then I looked up at Tiffany's smug face, alight with the thrill of the hunt. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The fear I'd lived with for 15 years, the fear of exposure was gone, replaced by something cold, hard, and sharp. She wanted a fight. Fine. She was about to get one she could never have anticipated. I placed my napkin on the table. Excuse me for a moment, I said, my voice even. I stood up and walked toward the restrooms, my steps measured. The moment I was in the privacy of the marble-clad ladies' room, I pulled out my own phone and called George Croft. George, I said, my voice low and urgent. I need a full workup on a family named Vance. Arthur Vance, formerly of Vance Industries. I need to know everything. Debts, assets, credit lines, recent financial inquiries. Everything. And I need it yesterday. Helen? Is everything all right? He asked, the concern in his voice immediate. He was more than an advisor. He was an old friend. Everything's fine, George. It's just time to do a little housekeeping. When I returned to the table, I simply said, a curious coincidence, but I'm afraid you're mistaken, dear. The lunch ended in a tense, awkward silence. Mark was confused, Tiffany was furious at my denial, and I was preparing for war. By the time I returned to my quiet apartment in Sacramento, George's preliminary report was already in my secure inbox. I sat down at my simple kitchen table, the one Tiffany probably thought was a cheap antique, and opened the file on my laptop. The screen glowed in the dim light, illuminating a story of financial desperation. What I saw made me gasp. The Vances weren't just in debt. They were drowning in it. The Napa estate was mortgaged to the hilt. They had multiple high-interest loans from private lenders. Their investment accounts had been systematically drained to maintain their lavish lifestyle. They were living on fumes, projecting an image of wealth that was a complete sham. But George had found something else, something far more chilling. He'd tracked recent inquiries into my shell corporations. Professional-level inquiries. He traced them back to a high-end private investigation firm in San Francisco. And he found the payment records for that firm, linked to a credit card belonging to one Tiffany Vance. The invoices were dated, starting just 2 weeks after she and Mark got engaged. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a recent discovery for her. This wasn't about a chance recognition at a wedding. This had been her plan all along. She had targeted my son. She had investigated my family, uncovered some breadcrumbs leading to my wealth, and married Mark as an investment strategy. The PI's report, which George managed to acquire a summary of, showed she'd instructed them to look for any hidden assets, any trusts, any sign of a large, secret inheritance. The wedding, the introductions, the public humiliation, it was all a calculated performance designed to force my hand. The phone rang again. It was George. Helen, there's more, he said, his voice grim. She hasn't just hired a PI. She's had a consultation with Markham and Finch. They're a boutique law firm in the city. They specialize in one thing: contentious, high-net-worth divorce cases and inheritance disputes. I just stared at the wall, the phone feeling heavy in my hand. The audacity of it. The cold, calculated cruelty. She hadn't just married my son under false pretenses. She was already planning how to rip our family apart for profit before the ink was even dry on the marriage certificate. I had spent 15 years building a fortress to protect my son from the poison of great wealth, and he had gone and invited a viper right through the front gate. And if you think hiring a PI and a divorce lawyer to target your new mother-in-law is the worst thing a person can do, let me tell you, you would be wrong. You have no idea how much lower she was willing to go. A week passed in tense, suffocating silence. Mark called a few times, trying to understand what was happening, but I put him off with vague assurances. I needed to handle this myself. Tiffany, I assume, was waiting for me to make the next move, to call her and offer a settlement to make her go away quietly. When I didn't, she escalated things in a way that was so vile, so profoundly cruel it took my breath away. She decided to attack a ghost. She went after my husband's legacy. George called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice was strained. "Helen, you need to see this." He sent me a link to an obscure tech blog, the kind that thrives on industry gossip and rumors. The headline was a punch to the gut. Silicon Valley pioneers patent under scrutiny. Allegations of stolen innovation emerge. My hand started to shake as I read the article. It was a masterpiece of innuendo and character assassination. It was filled with quotes from an anonymous source, a supposed former colleague of David's, who claimed that the core ideas behind the power management system weren't entirely David's. The article hinted that David had borrowed key concepts from this colleague, a man named Roger Finch, who had left their old company years ago under a cloud of bitterness. The piece was careful, using weasel words like allegedly and sources claim. But the damage was done. It painted my brilliant, honest husband as a thief. I knew with a certainty that settled like ice in my veins that this was Tiffany's work. There was no one else it could be. She had dug into David's professional past, found a disgruntled ex-employee, a man likely still smarting from being fired for incompetence, and paid him to dredge up old resentments and twist them into a lie. This was her new leverage. It was a disgusting scorched earth tactic designed to manufacture a scandal so toxic that I'd be forced to pay her anything to make it disappear. She was threatening to tarnish David's name in the history books, to rewrite his legacy, all for a bigger payday in their inevitable divorce settlement. I felt a grief so sharp and fresh it was like the day he died all over again. I had hidden my wealth to protect my son from its burdens. I had lived a lie to preserve David's vision of a normal life for Mark. And now this greedy, heartless woman was trying to destroy the one thing I had left of him that was pure and untouchable. His honor. His name. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark in my living room, clutching a framed photo of David from our early days in Palo Alto, his arm around me, both of us young and smiling, the whole future ahead of us. The anger I felt was a physical thing, a white-hot fire in my chest that burned away the tears. She had crossed a line that I didn't even know existed. You can come after my money, you can call me names in front of a crowd, but you do not touch my family. You do not desecrate the memory of my husband. She thought she was building a case against me for a bigger slice of the pie. What she didn't understand was that she had just signed her own demolition order. She thought she was creating a problem for me. In reality, she had just given me a reason to stop being the invisible woman, the quiet widow, the family disgrace. She had given me a reason to become the woman who commanded $1 billion portfolio, the woman who could crush people like her without a second thought. The game had changed. And now I was going to burn her world to the ground. The next morning, the grief had hardened into a diamond-hard resolve. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to obliterate her lies with the crushing weight of the truth. My first call wasn't to a lawyer. It was to a man named Ben Carter. Ben had been David's lab partner at the tech firm, his best friend since college, and one of the few people on earth who knew the real story of our finances. He'd retired to a quiet life of fly fishing in Oregon, but I knew he would drop everything for David. "Ben, it's Helen," I said when he answered, his voice warm and familiar. "I need your help. Someone is trying to say David stole his work." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a low growl that I could feel through the phone. "Who? Give me a name and an address, Helen. This is a 5-hour drive for me, but I can make it in 3. "First, I need proof, Ben," I said. a small smile touching my lips for the first time in days. I need to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the patent was David's and David's alone. 2 days later, Ben was in my Sacramento apartment, looking just as fierce and loyal as he had 30 years ago. We turned my spare bedroom into a war room. I had boxes shipped overnight from my climate-controlled storage unit, dusty containers filled with David's old professional life. For 3 solid days we did nothing but sift through the past. We powered up old hard drives, their fans whirring to life like ghosts from a bygone tech era. We unrolled yellowed schematics and blueprints, the paper crinkling under our fingers. We read through stacks of lab notebooks filled with David's cramped, precise handwriting, each page a testament to his methodical genius. It was emotionally wrenching. Every page was a memory. I found a doodle of a smiling stick figure of me in the margin of one notebook. Ben found an old email chain where they debated the name of their favorite barbecue joint. But we were on a mission. And then late on the 3rd night, fueled by stale coffee and sheer determination, we found it. Tucked away in a subfolder on a drive labeled Project Chimera 2009, we found the entire digital history of the invention. The Holy Grail. There were the initial concept emails between David and Ben, time-stamped a full year before the accuser, Roger Finch, had even joined their team. We found the digital logbooks, a meticulous daily record tracking every single experiment, every failure and every breakthrough. We found the early drafts of the patent application, with David's digital signature on every revision. But the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that made me drop my head into my hands and weep with relief, was a video file. It was a grainy webcam recording from David's old home office. He looked tired, but his eyes were electric with excitement. He was talking to the camera, explaining a major breakthrough he just had, using a whiteboard covered in his familiar scrawl of equations. It was the core of the power management system, the very heart of the invention. And the date stamp in the corner of the video was from May 14, 2009. 6 months before Roger Finch claimed he'd even discussed the idea with David. Ben and I sat there in the quiet glow of the monitor, the evidence laid out before us. It was irrefutable. It was absolute. We had everything we needed to not only disprove the lie, but to expose it for the malicious fabrication it was. Tiffany thought she was digging up dirt on a dead man, but she had made a critical mistake. She had underestimated his wife. I carefully copied all the files onto a secure thumb drive. I looked at the small piece of plastic in my hand, the digital ghost of my husband's genius. This was more than just evidence. It was ammunition. The game was over, and I was going to be the one to end it. The following evening, I told Mark I needed to speak with him and Tiffany. I told him it was urgent, that we needed to resolve this for everyone's sake. They arrived at my apartment looking like a mismatched team. Mark was pale and anxious, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Tiffany, on the other hand, radiated a smug, predatory confidence. She was dressed in another severe business suit, carrying a leather portfolio. She clearly believed this was the meeting where I would finally cave to her demands, broken by her attack on my husband's reputation. "Mom, thanks for sitting down with us," Mark began, his voice strained. "We need to figure this out." "Helen," Tiffany interrupted, taking charge as she sat in my favorite armchair as if it were a throne. "I want to start by saying that everything we discuss tonight is for the good of the family. We're all on the same side here." She opened her portfolio and slid a professionally bound document across my coffee table. "I've had my lawyer draft a proposal. After much consideration, we believe the best way forward is to establish a family foundation. It protects your privacy, provides significant tax advantages, and allows for a more collaborative approach to managing the family's assets for future generations." "Collaborative," I repeated, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Yes," she said, warming to her subject, her eyes gleaming. "We were thinking an initial funding of, say, $50 million to establish credibility in the philanthropic community. The foundation would be governed by a board of trustees. You, me, and Mark. 3 trustees, 3 equal votes. Very democratic, don't you think? It ensures all voices are heard in major financial decisions." I just looked at her. The sheer breathtaking nerve of it. She was trying to stage a corporate takeover of my life, using my own money. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I spoke. "That's a very thorough proposal, Tiffany," I said calmly. But I have a few documents of my own I'd like to share. I reached beside my armchair and picked up a simple manila folder. I opened it and took out the first paper. I placed it gently on the coffee table on top of her glossy proposal. This, I said, tapping the paper, is a full financial analysis of the Vance family. It details the 2 mortgages on the Napa estate, the outstanding balance on 3 high-interest private loans, and the current valuation of your parents' nearly depleted investment accounts. According to this, their net worth is actually negative. Tiffany's smile faltered. A flicker of alarm crossed her face. Her face went rigid. I took out a second set of papers. These are the invoices from Aguilar Private Investigations, detailing their research into my corporate structures, billed to your personal credit card. The first one is dated November 12th, 2 weeks after your engagement to my son. Mark, who had been watching in stunned silence, turned to his wife. "You hired a private investigator to look into my mom," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "It's not what it looks like, Mark. I was just being prudent," she began, but I cut her off. "And this," I said, placing a third document on the table, "is a record of your consultation with Markham & Finch, a law firm that specializes in contentious divorce litigation." I let that sink in, watching the color drain from her face. Then I reached back into the folder. "But you didn't stop there, did you, Tiffany? When you realized I wouldn't be easily intimidated, you decided to attack my late husband." I pulled out the thick stack of printed emails and logbook entries. "This is the complete development history of David's patent, including time-stamped evidence that proves his work predates his association with your source, Roger Finch, by over a year." I then took out the small thumb drive and set it on top of the pile. "And this is a video of David explaining his breakthrough 6 months before he ever met the man you paid to slander him. I have a copy for my lawyer, a copy for the tech blog that published your lies, and a copy for Mr. Finch's last known employer." Her carefully constructed composure was gone. She was staring at the pile of evidence as if it were a coiled snake. Her breathing was shallow. But I wasn't finished. "One last thing," I said. I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and hit play. A tinny, recorded voice filled the silent room. It was Tiffany talking to a friend. The audio slightly distorted but the words crystal clear. "I'm so tired of dating these guys with no ambition," her recorded voice said. "I mean, the salary he pulls is fine, but it's not a future. I need someone stable, from a family with good long-term prospects. A real inheritance. I'm not looking for a boyfriend. I'm looking for an investment. I need to find my golden ticket. You know?" The recording ended. The silence in the room was absolute, deafening. Mark was staring at his wife, his face a mask of utter devastation, as if he was seeing her for the very first time. And Tiffany just sat there, frozen, the architect of her own destruction, finally trapped in the ruins of her lies. For a long moment nobody moved. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a mundane noise in a moment of absolute life-altering destruction. Tiffany's face had crumpled, her mask of cool superiority replaced by the raw, ugly face of panic. But desperation, I learned, is a dangerous thing. Cornered and exposed, she didn't apologize. She didn't break down and cry. She got vicious. The very next day George called me. His voice was tight with anger. "She did it, Helen. She actually went through with it. She filed a formal complaint with the SEC. She's accusing your holding companies of improper reporting and potential insider trading regarding the Vance acquisition." It was a desperate Hail Mary pass. The claims were baseless, a work of fiction woven by a vindictive lawyer. But she knew an SEC investigation would be a nightmare. It would mean years of legal fees, depositions, forensic accountants crawling through every transaction David and I had ever made. And worst of all, it would be a public spectacle that would shred the privacy I'd guarded for so long. She was trying to drag me into a war of attrition, hoping I'd pay anything to avoid the fight. Her lawyer called mine a few hours later to schedule a meeting, to discuss a potential settlement and avoid further litigation, he'd said, his voice oozing false sincerity. We met 2 days later in a sterile, soulless conference room at a downtown law firm. It was me and George on one side of the massive mahogany table, and Tiffany, her parents, and her smarmy lawyer Markham on the other. Arthur and Catherine wouldn't even look at me. Tiffany, however, stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. The air was thick with hostility. Markham started, laying out their position in a long, blustering speech. He spoke of family responsibility, of Tiffany's emotional distress, of the alleged financial irregularities that had caused her such profound concern. It was all a smokescreen for what came next. Given the circumstances, he concluded, puffing out his chest, and in the interest of resolving this matter amicably, finalizing the terms of the pending divorce, and ensuring Ms. Vance's future financial security, she is prepared to accept a one-time settlement of $25 million. I almost laughed out loud. George shot me a look, but I remained perfectly still. I looked across the table at Tiffany, who was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and entitlement. I let the silence stretch, making them wait, making them feel the weight of their own audacity. Then I leaned forward. "Here is my counteroffer," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the room like a shard of ice. "You will withdraw the SEC complaint immediately. You will sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement that forbids you or any member of your family from ever contacting me or my son again, for any reason. In exchange, I will give you $5 million. A gasp came from Tiffany's mother. Arthur looked stunned. Markham's jaw tightened. $5 million. Tiffany spat, her voice laced with contempt. "After what you've put my family through, that's an insult." "It's $5 million more than you deserve," I replied calmly. "It's a gift. And it's my final offer." She looked at her lawyer, who was frantically whispering to her. He knew. He knew a baseless SEC complaint was a weak hand, and that my evidence against her, the PI, the slander, the recording, was a royal flush. But Tiffany's greed was a blinding force. $10 million, she said, her chin jutting out defiantly. $10 million and we have a deal. That's my final offer. I looked at her, this woman who had tried to destroy my husband's name, who had married my son as a business transaction, and I felt nothing but a cold, final clarity. I stood up. "The offer is no longer $5 million, I said, my voice like steel. I looked at George. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "For your audacity," I said, looking directly into Tiffany's shocked eyes. "The offer is now $4 million. And it expires in 60 seconds. Panic erupted on their side of the table. Markham was practically pleading with her. "Take the deal, Tiffany." Arthur hissed, his face pale as a sheet. "You can't do that," she shrieked at me. 45 seconds, I said, glancing at my watch. Okay. 5. We accept the $5 million. Markham yelled, jumping to his feet. I slowly sat back down. "Too late," I said. My offer was 4. But since I'm feeling generous today, I will honor the original offer of $5 million. George will have the papers and the wire transfer instructions ready within the hour. I suggest you sign them. I stood up, smoothed down my simple dress, and walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving them to sift through the wreckage of their own greed. The wire transfer went through. The papers were signed. Tiffany and her family vanished from our lives as quickly and quietly as $5 million could make them. The SEC complaint was withdrawn. On paper I had won. I had protected my husband's legacy, my fortune, and my son. But as I sat in my quiet apartment in the days that followed, there was no sense of victory. Just a hollow, aching silence. Because the real casualty in this war wasn't Tiffany's ambition or Arthur's company. It was my son. Mark was shattered. He moved into a small rental apartment across town, telling me he needed space. He was going through the motions of his own divorce, a process that was mercifully quick thanks to the settlement, but the emotional toll was devastating. He felt as though his entire life, his entire marriage had been a lie. He was humiliated, heartbroken, and deeply, profoundly angry. And a lot of that anger was directed at me. Our first conversation after the settlement was brutal. He called me, his voice raw with anguish. "Why, Mom? Just tell me why," he yelled into the phone. "All these years you let me believe we were just normal. You watched me work 60-hour weeks, stress about getting a promotion so I could afford a better life. You watched me save for years for a down payment, so proud of every penny. All while you were sitting on $1 billion. It was a lie. Your whole life was a lie to me." It felt like a punch to the gut. "It wasn't a lie, Mark," I tried to explain, my own voice trembling. It was protection. I wanted you to have your own life, to build your own success. I didn't want that money to define you. Define me? He shot back with a bitter laugh. It did define me. My entire marriage was defined by it, and I didn't even know it. She didn't marry me, Mom. She didn't love me. She married a trust fund she thought she could unlock. And you knew she was like that, didn't you? From the beginning. And you let me walk right into it. There was nothing I could say to that because a part of him was right. I had seen the warning signs, the calculation in her eyes, and I had stayed silent, hoping I was wrong, not wanting to interfere. We had many conversations like that over the next few months. Some were full of shouting and accusations. Others were just long, painful silences over the phone. I didn't defend myself. I just listened. I let him be angry. I let him grieve the life he thought he had. I apologized over and over, not for having the money but for the secret. I told him that my greatest fear had always been the money would come between us, and in trying to prevent it, I had made it happen. Slowly, gradually, after weeks of turmoil, something began to shift. The anger started to recede, replaced by a weary sadness. He called one afternoon, his voice quiet. "Can you tell me about Dad?" he asked. "Not just as a dad, but the inventor, the investor. I want to understand." So I told him. We talked for hours, and for the first time I told him everything. I told him about the late nights in the garage, the excitement of the patent sale, the careful strategy behind their investments. I shared the legacy his father had built, a legacy of genius and integrity. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. It wasn't a quick fix. Trust, once broken, is a fragile thing. Our relationship wasn't the same as it was before. It couldn't be. The simple, easy dynamic between a loving mother and her son had been replaced by something more complex, more honest, and in a way more real. We were no longer hiding behind a comfortable story. We were two adults, scarred and bruised, trying to find our way back to each other through the wreckage. We were rebuilding, not on a foundation of secrets, but on a foundation of hard-won, painful truth. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I sold the apartment in Sacramento. It held too many ghosts, too many memories of a life that was no longer mine. On George's advice, I set up trusts and systems to manage the bulk of the fortune, ensuring it would be handled responsibly for generations to come. Then, with my own future finally my own, I bought a small house in a quiet coastal town in Oregon. A place that smelled of salt and pine. A place where nobody knew my name. My first project was establishing the David Peterson Foundation. It's a small, quiet foundation. No galas, no press releases, no buildings with our name on them. We provide grants and a full college fund for brilliant young engineers from underprivileged backgrounds, the kind of kids David would have seen himself in. Last month, I sat on a video call with our first scholarship recipient, a young woman from rural Idaho who had designed a new kind of water purification system. Seeing her face, so full of hope and excitement as she talked about her plans, brought me a sense of peace that no stock dividend ever could. This was the right way to use his legacy. Mark and I continued to talk. The healing was slow, but it was steady. He was in therapy, working through the betrayal. He was rebuilding his own life on his own terms. Then one Sunday he called me, and for the first time in a long time, I heard genuine, unburdened happiness in his voice. "Mom," he said, "I met someone." My heart did a little flutter. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Her name is Laura," he said. "She's an architect. And she has no idea you're rich." "How do you know?" I asked, a real smile spreading across my face. "Because the other day I was telling her about my childhood. I told her my mom was a widow who lived a simple life in a normal apartment and drove an old Toyota. And she just smiled and said, 'She sounds like a woman who knows what's really important.'" A month later I met her. Mark drove up to my little house in Oregon. Laura stepped out of the car, and the first thing she did was hand me a small, lopsided ceramic pot she had made, with a succulent in it. "I heard you like tomatoes, so I figured you had a green thumb," she said with a warm, genuine smile. We had lunch at a simple cafe by the water. She was funny and smart with kind eyes. We spent 2 hours talking about gardening, architecture, and her rescue dog. She never once asked me what I did, or where I lived before, or anything about my finances. She just wanted to get to know me, the mother of the man she was falling for. As I watched her and Mark laughing together, holding hands across the table, I felt a knot in my chest that I hadn't even realized was there finally unwind. That's when I understood. My greatest wealth wasn't the number in my bank account. It was this: the chance to start over, the freedom to be authentic, the quiet joy of seeing my son truly happy, with a woman who loved him for exactly who he was. Life has taught me that the most elegant revenge isn't destroying the person who tried to humiliate you. It's building a beautiful, happy life in their absence. Thank you so much for listening to my story all the way to the end. It wasn't easy to share, but I feel it's important. I have to wonder, have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight for your own truth, especially against people you were supposed to trust? Let me know your story in the comments below. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone is the most powerful thing in the world. And if my story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more. You never know whose story you might need to hear next.